So here we go. So the intro to that trick is the following. I would like, here I'll start the question because I always forget I get on a roll and then I lose my train of thought. All right. All of these structures have a DNA backbone, 5' to 3', and we're showing base pairs as little light gray tick marks. As a reminder, DNA backbones, parallel, anti-parallel, both, neither, what's the deal? Anti-parallel. So they got to be 5 to 3. All right. Well, okay. So we're all on agreement on A. I'm totally fine with this is okay. That's the sort of standard view. All right. That's totally fine. Are there more? Not a lot of people liked B. What's the matter with B? Somebody, I heard that. It's not anti-parallel. I'm sure that's what everybody said, but they said it out of sync, so I couldn't hear it real clearly. Yes, so this is not anti-parallel. So this is not okay. What about C? What's people's complaint with C? I got a C works. Anybody want to say why? Yeah? You don't think C works at all? Tell me why. So like what he's saying is I don't think the backbone could sort of bend around and pair up like that. Is that what you're saying? So he's like, well, what kind of sequence would you have to make that work, right? Because it shouldn't, how are you going to set that up to base pair? And I hear you. It turns out that you can make sequences that would base pair, and that, as somebody out here said, C is actually legit. So let me show you what I mean. But I liked your answer because you have to do it right. If you have this is called a hairpin. So for example, if the sequence goes 5' yada yada, say G, 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 and then say, I don't know, T, T, C, 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 to 3'. This guy could go G, 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 T, T, C, 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 that's a G, and base pair happily. 5', 3'. So it's weird, right? At noon there was an objection. They're like, you're supposed to have 2 strands. That's only 1 strand. I totally hear you. It turns out you can, if the sequence is just right, have it base pair with itself and make what they call a hairpin. So the backbone actually goes shoop around like that. Right? That those T's are kind of poking out doing nothing, but everybody else is base pair. But the sequence has to be just right. Okay. Somebody with me on that one, because it's weird, but it's legit, and it's actually super important. Yeah. Yeah, would it be less functional? I mean, there's all kinds of weird things that will happen. Like, what's RNA polymerase going to do when it tries to read that? I mean, it's weird, right? There's going to be consequences, and those T's are going to be hanging out there. That's absolutely true. We're in the weird world of viruses, so certain weirdness is allowed. But yes, there's a bunch of issues. You would be well to feel if there are a bunch of issues with that. It turns out it's a thing.
Hi, my name is Brian White. I'm an associate professor in the biology department of the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I've been teaching freshman biology here for almost 25 years, and my research is in biology education. So when I first started at UMass, I did pretty much a straight lecture. I used the blackboard, in fact, at the very beginning. And then over time it changed, and as technology came in that allowed me to ask what we call clicker questions, a short multiple choice question where each student has a device that allows them to respond electronically to the question I've asked. There was some initially very primitive technology that I started using that was just infrared remotes. And that was so successful that I continued and expanded it from just 1 or 2 clicker questions to more. And so my classes had been started as straight lectures, and they got sort of increasingly interactive and active as time passed. So a couple things came together to make me want to change my class to a flipped classroom. One of them was, there were several issues with the class. That is, I wanted to do more active learning, but I didn't have time during the lecture because I had to present content. And so I didn't have time for active learning kinds of activities. Second of all, my class emphasizes problem solving. And that problem solving had been done largely in the lab sections by the graduate teaching assistants, some of whom were great at it and some of whom struggled with something as complicated as teaching students how to solve problems. So there was a problem of consistency there. And also the students were a little frustrated because they had come to lab looking for wet lab experience, looking through microscopes, working with petri dishes, that sort of thing. And a lot of what we did was problem solving. And so they were somewhat frustrated by that. And so there were sort of boiling problems with the class, nothing particularly serious, but a number of things that were bothering me. And then it happened that I worked with some people who were making a MOOC, a massively open online course for freshman biology. And in the course of that, we created a whole set of online resources that meant that I now could use that with some adaptation for the online materials for the flipped classroom. So I had these stewing problems, and then the solution came along in the form of these online materials, and it allowed me to flip the class. It was a bit of work, but not as much work as it would have been if I had to start from scratch. It was very interesting, the change, because, well, there were several different pieces. One of which is that because the students would see the material, at least some of it gets at least familiar with it before class started. I was then following on with my questions that I would ask them during class. And it felt strange at first to be asking them questions about something that I hadn't talked to them about. I had to keep remembering that they'd actually seen it on the video the night before. The other thing was changing my class to teaching by asking questions. And that took a bit of adapting to think of, rather than simply giving an explanation, how could I lead them to an explanation with a series of questions? And also there were some positive things, because I'd oftentimes found that to get students to the point where they could answer a very interesting question typically took most of the class. And so you come at the very end as they're closing their books and trying to leave the room to the point of the whole lecture. And oftentimes that would get lost in the shuffle. But the nice thing about having the flipped classroom, among many other things, was that the students would have watched the video beforehand, and so I could spend much more time on the things that were difficult or interesting, or bringing things to a significant conclusion. So flipping a class is not a small undertaking. The largest piece of effort is to produce the online materials, which is a significant amount of work. However, once you set it up, you can use it over and over and over again. And the issues are to think about what platform you want to use, which has to do with which one you're comfortable working with, as well as which one facilitates the kind of activities you want your students to do, those sorts of things. So it's a platform choice. The second piece that's worth worrying about is what your video sources are. So I had the advantage of recorded videos of my lectures from when I had been lecturing before I went to active learning. So I could splice those in. And the advantage of those was that they were tailored to the particular students in my class. And so it would have been difficult to start this flipped class from the very beginning with none of those resources. Because one of the challenges is if you want to try to use online resources, they're not always exactly what you want. They have extra things that you're not interested in, or they don't have things that you want. So I found it most easy to use my own pre-existing videos. In addition, so there's the videos, you'll also want to incorporate questions to drive the students' video watching. So in my online materials, there's typically a series of short video clips with questions in between. And the questions are designed to guide the students' video watching. That is, to give them an idea of what the main points of the video are, what they should be watching for. And so tailoring those questions and writing them also represents a significant bit of effort. It's not that you really need programming experience. Most of the platforms that you use to generate these things are designed to be sort of WYSIWYG, drag and drop editors. And so programming is not strictly necessary in most cases to create your flipped classroom. That's an interesting question. I've had to think back over that to see whether I don't think that I've made very big changes. There's been little tweaks along the way as I learned sort of how to do this. But in general, I mean, the biggest difference, I mean, every year I revise the online materials a little bit in response to what I hear from the students and from class. But in general, I haven't made enormous revisions to the class or the structure of the class or the online materials over the past years. It seems to be a fairly successful formula. I was very pleased that the students' initial response, even to the very first sort of beta test version of the online materials and the flipped classroom, was extremely positive. I asked in my course evaluations what they liked about it, and the things they liked about it was it gave them time to practice and get ready for class. They could spend time in class on the things that are difficult to learn, and they could review the material online. And it's also because the online assignments were there essentially for every class session, students felt like they were making progress. They had something to do, some way to study that they felt like they were getting somewhere. And on the online materials, they would get the questions right. And so they would get a sort of positive sense of making progress. Also, it's helped me to fine tune the class a lot. That is, I've gotten comments from students that sometimes the videos are too long, and we've looked at those. Sometimes the questions are confusing. I can learn that from feedback from the students. And especially now, because the class is active, I'll typically ask a question in class, and then I'll walk out into the classroom and talk to students. And that's where I learn the most about what they do and don't understand. And I've made extensive revisions, not to the overall structure of the class, but to individual questions and the way I structure my sessions, now understanding much better what the students struggle with. That I had some guesses with my multiple choice questions of what the wrong answers were and what they would and would not understand. And then the opportunity to step out into the classroom and talk to the students and help them allows me to really get a much clearer picture of what they are and are not getting, and to then adjust my questions accordingly. And the evaluations from the students continue to be extremely positive. They really appreciate this way, which is very gratifying, and also it's good to know because it makes it sort of worth the effort to have made the change. So there's a couple of things. There are many reasons to like it. It gives the students a sort of something to follow along with and something to review before the class. It makes the class move much faster because you're thinking and talking and working with the students. Also, interestingly, it changes talking in class from a problem value. Back when I was not doing active learning, I was always shushing the students so that people could hear me. But now talking in class is a positive thing. And it's because they want to talk to their neighbor about the questions that they're answering. And so it's made a number of positive changes. It's also a significant investment of time, and important to pick your resources well. That is, it's important to take care in the videos and the questions that you put up so that the students find that a helpful and rewarding experience as opposed to a frustrating experience. You want to try to make sure that when they're struggling with the biology or the subject matter, not with the limits of the technology. I particularly enjoy teaching this way because it is much more interactive, and I have a much better sense of what the students are and are not getting than I used to have when I was doing more passive lectures. The other thing I'd encourage people to think about, so because I had this fortunate experience of working with people and making the MOOC, I had all these video resources all at once, so I could flip my class in its entirety. That can be rather daunting for people because it was a rather significant amount of work. But it isn't strictly necessary to flip your entire class from the very beginning. That is, you could imagine for essentially each class session, you might have 5 or 10 or maybe 15 minutes of material, which is just sort of introductory material to get the students ready, get them some vocabulary, some basic ideas that you then want them to grapple with during class. And so rather than flipping all of the content, you could put the first 5 or 10 minutes, the part where you feel like you're reading material into the record. You could put that online with some questions, get the students warmed up with that. And then you can do more questions in lecture and then also just plain old lecture. But it can free up time in class to do more active learning things if you move some of the content presentation time online. And so It's the kind of thing that you could build up gradually over time, adding more and more flipped materials to your class and have it grow gradually, piece by piece, as you learn to make it work, rather than trying to do it all at once, as I do. I don't know where to put this in, but one of the particularly interesting things is to transform your class from a class about where you're presenting information by just saying it, to a class where you try to want to lead the students into understanding it through a series of questions. And currently I'm working with a sort of under two hypotheses, is that the use of the questions that I ask in class is twofold. The first one is that it gives me license to discuss the wrong answers, because in these classroom response systems, you can see that some students have got it wrong. And it gives me license to discuss the wrong answers, because many times knowing why the wrong answer is wrong can be even more useful than simply knowing the right answer. So that's one piece. The other working hypothesis that I have is that students are most ready to hear the explanation that you want to give right after they've got a question wrong. So if you ask them a question and they've thought about it, and they've entered an answer and they get it correct, that's great. But if they get it wrong, the point is that's not a failure. That's a point where their brain is ready now. They're wondering why they got it wrong, and that's sort of the perfect time to explain to them what's actually going on, and they're quite receptive to what you want to try to tell them. So it's a different way to teach. The evidence is that active learning is significantly more effective than straight lectures, and this is by flipping your class, it gives you the time to do the active learning that you wouldn't already have. When I first started, the very first semester that I flipped the class, I was afraid of what I called course collapse. What I was worried was that the students would not do the online materials. They would come to class unprepared. And as I asked questions, it was clear that they would not be ready. So I would then respond by lecturing and explaining the material. And that would lead to a sort of vicious cycle where they now know they don't need to come prepared because I'm going to lecture about the material. And very quickly, the class would go back to the old-fashioned lecture way. So I was afraid of that at the beginning. And it turns out not to have come to pass. And I think there's a couple things. One of them is what I do is we start off in class and I teach the class as though they have seen the materials online. I do not expect that they understood it 100%, but at least the terminology and some of the ideas should be familiar. And so we start from that and we move on. And the notion is if you didn't prepare, or if it wasn't clear from the online materials, it'll either become clear in class, or you should then go back and review so that it should become clear. The other thing is, the other feature is, and this is perhaps a feature of large classes, is in any given class, there's enough students who do come prepared, either because they know the material from before, or they were prepared from the online materials that they watched, so that a conversation can get started, even if not everyone is prepared. Because on average, we've done some studies, about half the students watch the videos online. Now, some of that may be because they already knew the material and don't need to watch the videos, and some of maybe they chose not to watch the video. In any case, we are still able to have a productive discussion, even if not necessarily everyone is prepared. And perhaps in a much smaller class, that would be more difficult because if people were not prepared, you might find yourself in a more awkward position. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. No, that's interesting.